Hey, this is Ben. Today we're talking about whether or not the Bible condones slavery. This is kind of a hot button issue because there's all kinds of verses in the Bible that say, here's how to properly, handle your slaves. And so it would appear that it sort of implicitly does condone slavery. But at the same time, there's other verses like in Luke 6 where it says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I mean, I don't know if you want someone to be a slave. If you want to be a slave, I don't know. But like, Jesus is like going on and on there in Luke 6 about how to be, you got to be super compassionate to everyone and do super nice things for everyone, even though if people do horrible things to you. And it's sort of like Jesus' example was, he died for our sins even though, we hate him. So like, how do you square that with slavery? Because slavery, that's not being super nice and compassionate. And then like we look at, it gets even weirder. If we look at Colossians 4 verse 1, it says, Masters, be just and fair to your slaves. Remember that you also have a master in heaven. Okay, how do you be just and fair to a slave? How could you possibly? How's it ever fair and just for a slave? You're a slave. It's not good for you. You have to work all the time, right? For free. Well, the bottom line is slavery in biblical times wasn't exactly like what we think of in the more recent years and even today where it exists. Basically, people worked for other people for longer periods of time. And it was very common for someone to take a job for a year. So you get hired on for a year. You wouldn't have someone who would get hired by the job, hired by the week, or paid by the hour, or this kind of thing. And many times what people would do, they would sell themselves into slavery. They would say, okay, I need money. Maybe I want to buy a house or some land or a bunch of animals, or maybe I need a bride price, or maybe I have a big debt where I borrowed money from someone and I'm having trouble paying it off. What people would do they would literally sell themselves. So like, it's like I need money and I come up to you and I say, I want to sell myself to you for some money, and I'll do whatever you need. Okay? And I get the money, and then I use the money for whatever I want. Okay, so it was voluntary. Slavery was used as a means of getting money and getting yourself out of a pinch, or getting ahead, or however you want to look at it. And that was something that was normally done. And so we can see how, the Bible would say, be just and fair to your slave. Like, in other words, don't treat them all terrible. And the Bible goes on and on with all these regulations. Don't treat your slave terrible. They've sold themselves to you, so take care of them. So like, the slave was supposed to be housed and clothed and food, or fed. And, you weren't just supposed to just treat them horrible. Because, take advantage of the position that, in the agreement. Because you've given them money up front and they've made this commitment to you. So that's basically what's going on there. And slavery in the Bible, and now a lot of people were kidnapped or forced into slavery or captured, but biblically speaking, that was condemned. I mean, it says, whoever steals a man or kidnaps a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Exodus 21:16, which is the same chapter where everyone, says the Bible condones slavery. Here's all these regulations about how to handle slavery. Yeah, this is the chapter, this Exodus 21. But right here in verse 16, it's a blatant statement. Slavery has to be voluntary. Anyone who involves themselves in the purchasing of an involuntary slave or the actual capture must be put to death. Okay, so the punishment for that is death. So, the Bible, it actually condemns slavery pretty strongly in the sense that we normally think of the word, where someone has to work for somebody whether they like it or not. Yeah, so, oh, and I guess another question would be, like, whether or not, well, could this be seen as like a scam to take advantage of poor people and then they've got to work for you? Well, no. At least not in the Bible it wasn't used as a scam, because the Bible required that no one could sell themselves into slavery for greater than 6 years. And after 6 years, a person had to make a choice. They could go free, or they could make it permanent and stay a slave. So they had to publicly say, I love my master and I want to, stay his slave. And if they did this, the master had to take an awl and pierce the person's ear, and through the ear, like into a door. And the point is there that there's no way when that happens he's not right next to the door, because doors weren't very common. A lot of people lived in tents, and a lot of people lived in houses with curtains, and a door would be something that you would put in a very public, very important spot where a lot of people would be. So the point is that would be a public ceremony, and that was kind of a way of making sure that it was public, so that a person couldn't just, oh yeah, he committed himself to slavery. It had to be done in public, and there had to be witnesses. So yeah, that's how that was done. Oh, and the other thing is, when a slave went free, the master had to share with him some of the profits from, whatever the profits were of having the slave. Now, another question that comes up regarding this is the question of, well, does the Bible instruct on how to properly beat slaves? Does it give like special permissions? And the short answer is no. Like, if you read certain translations, it reads certain ways. So like if you read in the NIV here in Exodus 21 verse 20 and 21, it makes it sound like, it says, when a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies, he shall be punished, but if the slave survives a day or two, he shall not be punished, for the slave is his property. And it's like, okay, so punishment. Well, punishment's kind of a weak word. A more literal translation, like the ESV, says, when a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. Okay, we get what it's talking about there. In fact, it says later on, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe, and life for life. So in other words, if you murder your slave, or if you just beat your slave too severely to the point that he dies, you have to die. It doesn't say it's okay to beat your slave. It just says you don't wait more than 2 days to see if the slave's going to die. Why? Because the slave has to get back to work. The slave is his property. Okay? Well, is it okay to beat slaves in the Bible? No. I mean, it goes on. It's, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, in verse 26, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. Or if he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, and the slave shall go free because of his tooth. So in other words, if there's clear evidence that damage was caused to the slave, okay, so I mean, who knows what happened behind the scenes, but if there's clear evidence that we can prove that the master has, beaten his slave, the slave must go free, and the master, he loses that money he paid to the slave, and the slave basically, especially if it happens like, you sell yourself into slavery, the next day he knocks your tooth out, you go free, and you got the money, and you're missing a tooth. So that was how that was handled. I guess the final question we need to deal with is whether or not the Bible condones like sexual slavery in the case of women, and having, if you own a female slave. And the verse that is used to propose that it does is also in Exodus 21, and it's verses 4, 5, and 6. And really what this boils down to is like a translational issue. If you read the New Living Translation, or the NLT, it reads one way, but if you read a more literal translation, it reads another way. And the point is that the NLT is trying to make it a little easier to understand for you, and it sort of gives to do that, it has to give a little bit of an interpretation of the text instead of just a literal translation. And every translation really is an interpretation, because oftentimes there's no word that is equivalent to the other word. So it's always good to, you know, before you go saying that you're real sure that something outrageous has been said, to double check other translations. And if it's like a critical word somewhere, you need to like look up that word maybe, because there's all kinds of references, especially on the internet, available. So like, I'm going to read this passage in the NLT, and then I'm going to read it in the ESV, and we'll see like how different it is. Alright, so here's the NLT, Exodus 21, 7, 8, and 9. And it says, "When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she will not be freed at the end of 6 years as the men are. If she does not satisfy her owner, he must allow her to be bought back again. But if he is not allowed to sell her to foreigners, since he is the one who broke the contract with her. But if the slave's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may no longer treat her as a slave, but as a daughter." And it goes on in verse 10 and 11. "If a man who has married a slave wife takes another wife for himself, he must not neglect the rights of the first wife to food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. If he fails in any of these three obligations, she may leave as a free woman without making any payment." And that's like, whoa. Well, that seems like, you know, women don't get to be freed at the end of 6 years as the men are. You know, because the verses where it says the men get freed at the end of 6 years are like right above this. The thing about the door and the awl and piercing the ear. And then this thing like, you know, he can have a slave as his wife as long as, you know, he clothes her, feeds her, and makes sure he has regular sex with her. And that, it sounds a little weird. So anyway, let's read it in like a more literal translation. Alright, ESV. "When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do." Okay, so that's more literal. It's not putting an interpretation on the text. That leaves a lot of room for questions. Like, does that mean that it doesn't go work in the field like male slaves? In other words, the male slaves would go out every day, and in Hebrew society probably take care of sheep, and they would have to fight off raiders, you know, marauders, because in these times not everyone was civilized, not everyone had law and government, and there were people in outer areas, you know, basically barbarians, like the Romans had to deal with white people or barbarians invading and just stealing stuff and killing people. You know, Vikings and in Muslim civilization they had the same problem coming from outside, you know, their region, people just coming in, raiding and leaving. So I mean, it's a little bit, you know, it kind of puts women down as far as their, you know, their strength abilities, but I mean, it's nowhere near saying, you know, she can't be freed at the end of 6 years. So anyway, it says, "If she does not please her master who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed." Okay, please, and she's not working good. In other words, he shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people since he has broken faith with her. Alright, in other words, if a girl has been sold into slavery before she's a woman and she's still a daughter, if a father sells his daughter, then, and if she's not a good slave, she doesn't do a good job. So in our sense, we would think if a teenager is sold into slavery by her parent, if someone's parent hooks the teenager up with this job for whatever reason, she can't be sold to someone else because she's not doing a good job. She has to go back to her parents. That's what it says. Alright, anyway, if he designates her for his son, so she can be transferred to the father can transfer her to his son. In other words, if he dies, he can become, you know, and since that's his son, that's still part of his household. But if he does so, he has to treat her as a daughter. The son, it's the slave of the son, and the father has to treat her as the daughter. Okay? Anyway, it says, "If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, clothing, or her marital rights." In other words, you have a son, you designate this female slave to your son, you treat her as a daughter. Now, if you take another wife, in other words, you make a link to a new woman, maybe your wife died, okay, you don't disrespect your son, but you also don't disrespect the slave that, you know, that belonged to your son either. Okay? So, for whatever reason, you don't diminish that slave woman's food, clothing, or marital rights. Now, if you do not do these things, she shall be set free, and she shall not have to pay back, you know, the slave price. So that's a huge difference. So at the very least, I would say, kind of study up a little bit on the differences and the history. I'll say no more. I'll stop there because I rambled too long. Thanks. Bye. I apologize. I had to come back to deal with just one more simple but important question of, well, and the question is just why was slavery so different back then? Why is that? Why was there this weird form of slavery? And the simple answer is technology has changed society and made certain things work differently. So today I can like go to the grocery store and get salt cured bacon, and I can get bread which has been sliced in a plastic bag. I can get milk in a container, it's been homogenized. I can get soap. I can go to, you know, like Walmart and buy clothes. I can buy a pair of socks. All of that I would have had to make and do myself, and a lot of that didn't exist at all for anyone. But if I had any form of it, I would have had to make myself once upon a time. Today we have refrigerated trucks to ship eggs on. Okay? So things weren't as easy to accomplish. We didn't have the technology back then. So if everything had to be done at the home or on site, people tended to pool their resources together, and if one guy had land and had an infrastructure and like had a bunch of cows and a bunch of people to make clothes and, you know, paper, maybe a teacher to like teach the kids to read and write, you would like go and just be a slave of that person, and it would work out good for you and for your children, because your children, you know, they wouldn't be slaves because you were a slave. They would be free, you know, and they might benefit from the setup you had of them living at, you know, your master's house, and you probably would too. It depended kind of on your area and where you lived and that kind of thing. So things were different because things were different, and because what people were able to pull off is completely different today. We have such better technology today. It's gross how much wealthier we are, and we don't have to sell ourselves into slavery to make ends meet. But anyway, there's that. It's the real ending. Thanks. Bye.